and Modern Worlds. Yes, we are just about to ask for your permission to record this event. So I hope you'll be able to accept, as this event will be recorded and made public on the Lynn Center website. Thank you all for coming to this roundtable of the Research Group on Global Justice of the Ypi Lynn Center, in which we are delighted to be able to welcome Lea Ypi, as well as Maria Popova, for a discussion of Lea Ypi's incredible memoir, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. Welcome, Lea, and welcome, Maria. And thank you very much to the audience for coming. I just want to show a brief slide of Lea's past visits to Montreal. As you all know, she's been a regular visitor to Montreal since 2014, I think, when she came to a conference that I organized on global justice and colonialism. So the top picture, as you can see, was after the conference, where we went to the Old City and walked around with her colleague there, Catherine Lu from LSE as well. And you can see the Habs flags flying in the background, which must mean that it was around the time of the playoffs. So that was a great fun. And then the pictures at the bottom, I think many of the people from GRIP are going to remember that Lea came to give a talk, the inaugural talk, I think, of GRIP in the fall of 2018. And she came with her one-year-old baby, Hannah, and the plane was late, so we waited for her at Arash Abizade's home. She came and gave her talk, but then Hannah woke up in the middle, so she had to basically get the baby and carry on, which she did. So the show definitely went on, and it was such a pleasure to have her in 2018. And really, we were really hoping that we'd be able to have her come as well in person now, but unfortunately, this was not possible for this January. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that now. However, welcome to Zoom and Montreal, and also to many other guests who have joined from all over the world. Thank you all very much for coming. And today we're going to engage in a conversation with Lea. She's a professor of political theory at LSE, and her memoir, Free, has garnered substantial recognition and awards already since its publication very recently, really, I think last fall in the UK and Europe, but very recently only published in North America. Just to give you an idea, it was shortlisted for the 2021 Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, the 2021 Costa Biography Award. It is on the Best Book of the Year lists of the Sunday Times, the Financial Times, the New Yorker, the Times Literary Supplement, the Guardian Best Book of the Year list. And it has also received several Book of the Year list awards in the Netherlands, Spain, Germany, Sweden, and Albania. And it is being translated into 18 languages and counting. So I think this is evidence that the book, has resonance, I would say, in our contemporary times. And many people from many parts of the world are fascinated by it. And it has inspired people, I think, to look back on the past 30 years, I would say, of the transition from communism to the world that we see today. I should also mention, of course, that Lea is an author of several other groundbreaking works. My personal favorite, Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, which I thought should have won many awards as well as The Meaning of Partisanship with Jonathan White. And most recently, while she was publishing Free, her memoir, she also published The Architectonic of Reason, Purposiveness and Systematic Unity in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So in case you want to read more Ypi, I also very highly suggest those works as well. All right, well, welcome, Lea. And I want to also introduce that our other panelist for the roundtable is Professor Maria Popova, and she is my dear colleague in the Department of Political Science. She's the Jean Monnet Chair, and she will also be helping me, I hope, think about what it means to have lived under communism and help me also to ask questions with Lea and share memories. So thank you so much, Maria, for coming and joining the discussion as well. All right, so Lea, I wanted to start this conversation with asking you about when did you start to think about writing this memoir, and why did you think it was the time to write it?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and to Catherine for organizing, and to Maria for joining the conversation and sharing her memories and her thoughts as well. I'm really sorry that it's actually not in person. This would have been my third visit in Montreal, so I'm there in spirit, but it's nice to be able to talk to everyone about it. So I didn't really want to write a memoir, and I almost don't think of it as a memoir. It eventually became a memoir, but I wanted to, so I was writing academic books, as you know, as you mentioned, and then I was writing more and more op-eds and things for a kind of wider public. And at some point I was approached to write a public book, like a trade book for the kind of a non-academic book for the wider public. And I thought and talked to my editor about it, and I said that I wanted to write a book on the idea of freedom, which has been this kind of central concern of mine for many, many years. And one of the things that I always wanted to write about is how in the kind of liberal and in the socialist traditions of political thought, to me, it seemed that freedom is central. And there's different ways of understanding freedom and different articulations institutionally of it. But I wanted to write about this kind of shared concern. And then in the process of thinking about this book and what it was going to be, and bringing in all my intellectual heroes like Kant and Marx and what you name it, global justice, democratic theory, whatever, somehow completely by coincidence, almost Albania came into the mix, because I kept thinking about examples of, what freedom, the yearning for freedom, how people wanted to have freedom, how freedom related to democracy. And as Maria will recall, if you grew up in Eastern Europe in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, in the 90s, this was like a big deal politically, freedom and how it connects to institutions and so on. And so this project of kind of writing about ideas and this more like political theory / intellectual project became more and more one of like recalling stuff from the past. And as I was recalling stuff for the past, it was also like almost like undergoing psychoanalytic treatment with yourself, because you kind of ask yourself, well, how did I get to write these books about global justice and about democratic theory? And why do I care about colonialism? And, all these central themes of my research at some point became connected to my life in a way in which I hadn't really seen the connection before. But through the process of writing this book, it became clear to me where they were coming from. So it was almost like discovering the kind of genealogical roots of it. And the other, so that's one answer to the question. The other answer to the question is that I have always loved literature, as you know, Catherine, and fiction, and reading stuff that was not political theory and academia and so on. And I've also always had a kind of suppressed writer in me. So when I was given the chance of writing a book for a wider public, I thought, well, I might as well just let the suppressed writer write in the way in which they would have wanted to write. And I was lucky enough to meet people like my agent, my editor, various other people outside academia that were very encouraging. And I was completely not confident and also very reluctant at this point, because I had almost given up on actually doing more creative literary writing. But I had lots of encouragement. So with those two things together, the book became what it is in a way. But I didn't set out to write it like that. And I think it was almost like a kind of discovery. And all the things kind of emerged, all the themes emerged, and the memories came back, and the connection between the memories and the ideas also came back. And so it was all much less structured than any other book I've ever done, actually, or any other project I've embarked upon.
Wonderful. Although I remember reading the proposal that you sent me, earlier, and I thought it was already incredibly well structured, and the resulting book actually was fairly similar, I think, to that original proposal. So, and I do think one of the things that strikes me about the book is how philosophical it is, right? It's a kind of personal narrative, but with real philosophical points, right? And that help to capture like debates, fundamental debates we still have about, what is freedom, what makes it valuable, problems of agency, problems of institutions, structures, all of those things, colonialism, and so on. Now, one thing that, because I'm assuming that many people in the audience have not yet read your book, so we're going to give you a few spoilers, I think, for those of you who haven't read it, but hopefully also enticements to actually read the book. But one of the spoilers is I want to mention to start off is that Lea, you grew up until the age of 11, being very protected in a way by your parents about what eventually you understood to be your political biography, your personal family biography. So can you talk a little bit about that, starting with when you found out, or when you were told the truth by your parents about your family history? And I'll share just a little screen here so that people can see who you are going to be discussing a little bit. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so so the book starts, maybe this is the best way into the conversation and into talking about this point, actually. It's with the first chapter of the book, which starts with me coming out of school one day wearing my school uniform and ending up in a protest and being really scared and hearing all these people shouting freedom and democracy, and to kind of run away from the protesters and the police and so on. I go to hug a Stalin statue that was always in this kind of near the Palace of Culture of my hometown, which is this port town on the Adriatic Sea in Albania. And as I wrote on the diary on that day, I'd been hearing all these shouts of freedom and democracy and so on. And for many months in Albania, there was talk of freedom and democracy as in part some kind of movement of subversion in the country. And the state television called these movements hooligans. And so the idea was these were not political movements. It wasn't a political protest. It was just people who were kind of disrupting public peace and order and so on. And this was December 1990, which is exactly 1 year after more than 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where a lot of things have happened in Eastern Europe. But Albania was a very isolated society. Until that point, it had more or less broken off relations with all other socialist countries in Europe. And so the idea that there were all these transformations going on in the rest of Eastern Europe didn't affect Albania. And Albania was still very isolated, Stalinist, committed socialist country, and in which there was obviously state ideology which pervaded school and education, and I was part of it. And so at the age of 11, there I was. I had just become a pioneer. The pioneers were for people who don't know, the kind of communist organization in Eastern Europe, I think more widely, not just in Albania. And we had these moral education classes in school in which we were talked about Albania and socialism and the role of pioneers in promoting global socialism and so on. So I was completely convinced of all that and believed it. And of course, things economically weren't great, but we were used to them. There were queues, and you knew there were queues, and there were these kind of daily constraints. But if you live in a world in which you don't think things are about to change fundamentally from one day to the other, you just take for granted the constraints. And I think that's what I was doing at the time. It started to change for me when I noticed that my perception and that of my parents' perception were slightly different. So while I lived in this country where I thought there was sacrifice and hardship and things that were done in a certain way and you just had to accept, but I more or less accepted them in the way in which they were done and were presented to me ideologically, I began to notice that my parents had a different perspective on this, and that first of all, they seemed a lot more excited than I was about the protesters. Second, they seemed to think, unlike me, that we actually didn't have freedom and democracy. Whereas I remember hearing these slogans and thinking, well, we've already got freedom, we've already got democracy, so what do they want? And for my parents, this was like really a big deal. until I discovered eventually that the point of view of the family and the point of view of the state, which for me had been overlapping with some mysteries here and there for all my life, were actually completely not aligned, in the sense that I was told one thing in school. And while I thought that my parents supported the school narrative, I later discovered that they only supported it because they were afraid and they were trying to protect me from what they had been subjected to. And so this is the second part, in a way, of the story of my, of the kind of coming of age story, is this discovery that I was living in a dissident family, which had a problematic relationship to the government from very early on, basically from the arrival of communism in Albania, because my grandfather was, who was a socialist, was a political prisoner for 15 years, but I had never been told that he was a political prisoner. And on my mother's side, they were big, rich property owners who had been expropriated, and of course had also had their share of hardship from the new socialist government that came into power in 1946. And the most important of all was this character that is in the photo on the top left, who is called Lea Ypi, who was Prime Minister of Albania and then later Minister of Interior, but had entered into the pages of Albanian history because he was the equivalent of the Vichy government when Albania was invaded by the fascists. This man, who had the same name and surname as my father, was pivotal in passing the sovereignty of Albania to this colonial administration, this Italian colonial administration. And so he was like a quisling, the head of a kind of quisling institution. And while I was a child, I had always been, this was somehow in the background in my family. And while I was a child, I had been told that this man had nothing to do with us, that it was just the name and same name and surname by coincidence, until I discovered that he wasn't actually unrelated. In fact, he was my great-grandfather. And I had not been told this because this was such a stain on what was on your biography, what was called your biography, that people, my parents, were trying to kind of shelter me for as long as I could. And the really interesting question, and the kind of question of my life in a way, is when would I have discovered that truth? Because there was a point where everybody discovered the truth, and we'll probably talk about this, you know, when does this waking up moment come and how does it come and how does it... But for me, the discovery of the truth coincided with the fall of the socialist system in Albania and with the arrival of liberalism. And so this is what the, in a way, the setup of the book is.
Yes, and let's talk about that biography, because I think both Maria and I can relate to this problem of biography as a source of unfreedom in a one-party state where you're on the wrong side. So Maria, I'm going to now show another slide here of Maria. So Maria, can you talk a bit about your grandfather and the complicated biography of your family on that side?
Thanks, Catherine. So I'll actually start by saying that I absolutely loved reading Lea's book. As I was reading every single episode that she recounted, I could find one similar episode from my own childhood, and both under communism and in the post-communist section as well. And it was so interesting that some of these very similar episodes I interpreted slightly differently, some of them the same. I mean, it was just such a dialogue for me when I was reading this book. It was extremely fun to read. So on the question of biography and its importance, it's very interesting that in some way, in a lot of ways, my experience was sort of a mirror image of the experience that Lea describes. And with the grandfathers, it's also this strange mirror where my grandfather actually had a good biography. He had grown up in a family where his father was a member of the Communist Party from before the communists came to power, and had actually shielded some partisans who were hiding from the fascist regime. So they had a good biography. But at the same time, my great-grandfather who was an orphan, started out, very poor, was kind of towards the end of the pre-communist period, was doing well. He had his own butcher shop, and he had sent all his kids to these prestigious private high schools, where my grandfather grew up going to school with the children of big industrialists, and he trained as a reservist in the King's Army. And then World War II happened. He fought briefly in World War II, and he returned, and the communists came to power, and it was fine to him. He kind of identified as a communist from his family, but then the communists started doing things that I think he didn't actually like, and on top of it, because he had this good biography, he was forcefully drafted into the army and made an army officer, even though that's not what he intended to do with his life at all. In fact, he said that he tried to get out of it several times, but no, they said, you have a good biography, you have to be an army officer. So he spent his entire career as an army officer, going up to colonel, and he had a massive stroke when he was 58 and was retired in, I think, 79 or so. And after he retired, he was staying at home all the time. I mean, the massive stroke, he recovered from that quite well. And I remember in my childhood that he was always, very often, he would wake up from his afternoon naps with a scream, and then come into the living room cursing. He cursed a lot. And I would ask him, what was this nightmare? You had a nightmare again. And he said, you know, it's the damn nightmare that I have all the time, that I'm at a party meeting. They ask me to say something, because he was, of course, a Communist Party member as an officer. They're asking me to say something, and instead of saying what I'm supposed to say, I start just cursing them. And I wake up in sweat. And of course, to me, that was indicative that even if you're in the party, maybe you're not actually buying what the party is telling you, that you're in the party because you have to be in the party. So that's in some ways really the opposite biography of Lea's.
Excellent. I'm just going to very briefly set up also my own story, which is here on the top left also are my grandparents. My grandmother, Lea Lu, was born into a merchant family in 1914 in Hubei province, the capital of which is Wuhan. And my grandfather, my father's father here, is Huaichen Lu, and he was born in 1912 in the Jiangsu province of China, raised by a single mother in impoverished circumstances. However, he went into the foreign service and was posted in Ottawa during the Second World War. So already you know the problem of my biography, which is that he worked as a consular official for the nationalist government during the war. He completed actually his MA in 1941 and a PhD dissertation in 1943 on the evolution of the status of non-belligerency in international law at the University of Ottawa in 1943. My father then was born in Ottawa in 1940. But I was born in Beijing in 1969. So my father basically returned to the People's Republic of China in the late 50s. And this is where the biography was a very problem indeed during the Cultural Revolution. So Lea, I'd like to ask you about your experiences of this disruption, like you say, of finding out the truth and this disruption of reality, where you thought you were one person, then all of a sudden you realized you were another, right? Once you kind of understood the truth of your family situation. And in what way do you think that, I guess one question actually that Maria had was, did you have inklings as a child that your parents weren't as ideologically committed? And because part of your story sounds like you were very passionately enthralled by the ideology, but did you find that now looking back, perhaps there was actually quite a lot of skepticism and resistance going on that you perhaps weren't really aware of? Yeah. So how apparent was the truth? Was it as?
So there were definitely, as I said, there were definitely these kind of mysteries of my childhood. So one of them was the fact that I was, my grandmother spoke French to me when I was born. From day one, she spoke French to me. And this was not the norm in communist Albania for children to just be kind of spoken French randomly by some member of the family. And my grandmother, and so I could definitely notice that because I was the only one, and often when she wanted to tell me off, and when friends came around and she wanted to say, now this person needs to go home, she would say it in French or whatever. So basically it was a kind of language of interaction, and it was the first language she brought me up with. And I remember that I always asked them, why am I speaking French? Because my grandma, she didn't speak with a French accent. She didn't have relatives in France. She didn't have a French name or French surname or whatever. She had no connection to the country. So I often asked her, why is it? And she always dodged the question by saying, oh, well, you know, it's the language of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was kind of important in communist countries as a model of a kind of potentially emancipatory movement, the work of which needs to be carried forward. And so they always came up with these kinds of answers. There was often things about the way I was dressed that made them, so they would always do these hand knitted dresses with lots of laces and things, which also kind of stood out and made me look a little bit different, I think. Anyway, somehow the children had picked up that I was different, and I had picked up that I was somehow different, but I didn't know. And then the thing that really I remember I suffered from was first this connection with the Second World War heroes that Maria was also mentioning. This was really important, like who fought the fascists, on what side they fought. The memory of the war was always present in the historiography of these countries. And we didn't have anyone who had fought in the war. I always had to kind of fish for very distant relatives and come up with stories of why we didn't have anyone who was a partisan, but this was always celebrated and commemorated. And the other thing was that in a lot of houses, there were photos of Enver Hoxha displayed. And again, we didn't have a photo. And I remember asking my parents, well, why do we not have a photo? And again, they were always coming up with excuses about how they needed a nicer frame, or they were preparing it for my birthday, or when things like when Enver Hoxha died. I remember we were all watching the funeral, and I remember they were talking about the funeral music, and I was only about 5 or 6 at the time, but I knew that when someone dies, you cry, you don't talk about the music. And they didn't seem like devastated in the way in which I remember I felt devastated. And of course, everyone in Albania has a different story about that day and the experience and so on, but it certainly stays with them. So I think this knowledge that came in 1990, I don't really know what it did to me in terms of identity and kind of, you know, I remember that it was relatively abrupt knowledge, that it was kind of having these mysteries of your childhood and, you know, hearing people talk about things in code language and not knowing what it is that they're talking about, but somehow you're given these explanations that are given to children. So it's a little bit like, you know, my son Arbian recently discovered that Santa is not real. And he said to me, this is so terrible. How did you lie to me for so long? You know, how could you go on telling me about, and it kind of, you know, it does something to a child to discover that not everything that grown-ups tell them about themselves is true. So this is a kind of universal experience. In my case, I think it was exacerbated by the fact that it was a universal experience, not just about like Santa or the party or whatever, but it was actually about the people I was living with, whom I thought were always committed to this cause. And you discover that not only are they not committed to the cause, but they are actually the enemies that you're supposed to fight if you are committed to that cause, because society was shaped by class struggle so much that the idea was that if you're on the side of workers, you fight the bourgeoisie and you fight the aristocracy. And to discover that both the bourgeoisie, namely my mother's side, and the aristocracy, namely my father's side, were kind of where I was, and that there wasn't anyone who was in the working class in my family, was, I suppose, a kind of traumatic knowledge, which I always think you never know. These traumas of childhood, you always carry them with you for your whole life, and you don't really know what they do to you at any point in time, because they always reveal themselves in different ways at different points in time. But I suppose the one thing that it has done to me more generally, but I think this may also be, and I'd be interested to know whether you have this, a lot of people in Eastern Europe, I feel, are generally quite skeptical about a lot of stuff. So you tend not to be kind of believing in things in the way in which I find sometimes in the West, people are more willing to go with what they're given, or with and somehow you just accept it because, you know, that's what you do. You have to accept stuff, but you don't deep down accept it. And I think that's maybe one of the things that I find has left the greatest legacy in me, is this fundamental doubt that I have about everything, which sometimes becomes a source of deep skepticism, which can be quite destructive. and that you somehow have to fight within yourself to not turn it into a distraction, but to turn it into something more productive, this kind of fundamental doubt.
Yes, and I think actually that you have turned it into a great intellectual virtue, because I think of most political theorists I know, you probably of all of them exemplify an ability to detach yourself from the ideas and arguments that you make. I mean, I have been at many conferences and talks where people just are livid when somebody like describes liberalism in the wrong way. I mean, it's shocking really, but people who are supposed to be into the free exchange of ideas often are very attached emotionally to their own arguments and ideas. And I think you are somebody who really exemplifies this ability to, in a way, argue things based on, the arguments, the strength of the arguments, and you're willing to say, well, okay, that argument doesn't work, and, we move on and build a better argument. And I find that kind of detachment, inspiring. But also, I mean, I personally, of course, also sometimes get defensive about, when people challenge my ideas. But I find you are one of the most generous, intellectually generous people. And I think that might have something to do with turning around this ability to detach, from things and having a skepticism even about things to which you have been attached. Maria, do you want to jump in a bit about like this we're sort of moving into the next question about sort of the legacies of repression, but I think you had some more skepticism than Lea growing up about the ideological environment in which you were growing up.
Yeah, this was a very interesting part of the book for me, because I actually didn't think from my childhood experience, I almost didn't think that people existed who bought what the state was peddling. I really thought that everybody sort of realized that the communist state propaganda is, propaganda, and I think I sensed it even in school. Not just, I mean, my family never said anything outright anti-communist, as in, the communists are bad and we need democracy. They never said anything like that. But my father constantly told jokes about the regime. Every time there was a power cut, he would yell that it's Lenin's fault. I remember, I mean, it's especially contrasting for me, the description of in Lea's book of the death of Hoxha, because at about the same age, I was 7, and 82 is when Brezhnev died. And then the Soviet leaders started dying fairly regularly. So 82, 84, 85, 3 Soviet leaders died. And I remember in elementary school, every time one of them died, we were super happy because classes were canceled, and they were canceled because we had to stand guard next to a picture of the Soviet leader who had just died. And it was really exciting because people stood guard in pairs, boy, girl, and for an hour, and you stand by the picture. And we thought, oh, maybe I will get to stand guard with, this boy that I like next to the picture. But it never crossed my mind to actually mourn these people. So I think that must have seeped through as some sort of, sense that this is not, the propaganda that you hear on TV is just what you have to say, what you have to, you have to be careful. But the underlying sort of assumption for me was that none of it is true. So it does go, I mean, that also triggers skepticism, I think, in a similar way as if you find out at some point that what you believed it was not true. In my case, you just assume constantly that what the state tells you is not true.
Yeah, well, it does seem that we all have this experience of a kind of incongruence, between either public or private lives, or context. And in my case, actually, interestingly, although I grew up in Canada, I arrived in Canada in 1976 at the age of 6. But, my parents had gone through more than a decade of living in Mao's China, and were quite scarred by their experiences there, because they did experience persecution during the Cultural Revolution. So my experience in Canada was one of a clear disconnect between what my parents thought life was like and the rules you should live by, and the rules that my teachers in school told me about, and the very liberal democratic education I received as a child in Canada. So I learned how to be a democratic citizen, how if you want to protest things, you can go on demonstrations and write to your MP. And my parents, I remember when I was 16, I wanted to write a letter to my MP to protest I think it was the nuclear weapons, cruise missile testing in Canada. And my parents forbade it. They absolutely forbade it, because they thought that I would be blacklisted and therefore not be able to attend university, which was like the whole reason why they left China, right? Was that I could actually have a life. And so I ended up having to lie to them all the time. I would go to these peace demonstrations that were attended by 100,000 people. And I never could understand why my friends, like my Indian friends, could bring their grandmother and their younger sister to these demonstrations, and I had to sort of go with them and then tell my parents that I had done something else for the day, So this kind of disconnect perhaps, also feeds a kind of ability to detach from things.
It's really interesting. Sorry, I'll jump in just for a second to say that you were protesting these nuclear, armament, etc. But the nuclear war was the only thing that I actually bought from the regime. I mean, the only thing I believed is that the West wants to nuke us, and I was very afraid of that. But I think partly I believe they wanted to nuke us because we were that bad. And that's why they wanted to nuke us. They totally hated us. And I remember thinking, how do we prove that we're actually not so bad? That we, the people, are not responsible for this. Yes, yet we're gonna die from nuclear war.
Well, Lea, in your book, I think what I found stunning was how your parents and your grandparents did have major experiences of oppression, and yet they did seem to manage to maintain their sense of political agency. And they, as you said, your mother, your father, they were still quite politically active. And I wondered, do you want to talk a little bit about your grandmother, for example, and how it is that they were able to cultivate a sense of inner freedom in the face of, what was clearly very oppressive circumstances?
I mean, about my parents, I think that I can say that very quickly. They weren't political before the fall of the wall or the fall of the system. So they became political and they kind of acquired the political, they were political before, but they weren't outspokenly political, and they actually steered clear from politics. And they couldn't have been political anyway, because they were just not allowed in the party. This was one of the things, that the party was selective. It's not like you can apply and then be a party member in the way in which you can in a kind of liberal democracy. The party was not a voluntary organization. It was a Leninist vanguard, highly disciplined, highly selective organization. So my parents, even when they wanted to, in fact, one of the questions was that my mother, whenever she changed schools, because she was quite fluent and she was outspoken and so on, so she was someone who could have been good in politics, and so whenever she changed school, someone wanted to suggest her to join the party, and then they discovered who she was, and they're like, no, sorry, we didn't realize you can't be in the party. And so my parents were always they took an interest, my dad especially took an interest in politics, but the way he reflected that was always through the politics of what was on state television. So, for example, he always talked about the Nicaraguan war because that's what the television talked about, the Nicaraguan war, or he talked about the apartheid because that was the apartheid. But it's not like he talked about this kind of more complicated politics that would have had an impact on Albania. But they did become more, especially my mother became much more prominent, much more outspoken politically afterwards, because she joined this first opposition party. Whereas my grandmother she's a very interesting character, because in a way she was the most oppressed of all, because my parents, they were born in communism and lived all their lives in communism. So the change for them came when they were already fully formed human beings in a way that had all been fully formed under this communist system. My grandmother was born in Salonika, which was part of the Ottoman Empire and was one of the kind of most cosmopolitan cities of the Ottoman Empire at the point in which the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and had never been to Albania until she was 20, and then came to Albania because in part she was a person in search of an identity because the empire had collapsed and all these cities suddenly had a choice. There was a population exchange between Greece and Turkey, and all the people who didn't fit had to choose were they Greeks or were they Turks, and they were neither because they were Ottomans. They had lived under the Ottoman Empire, so their identity was one of a country that wasn't there and didn't exist anymore. So she came to Albania in a way in search of a country and was in this kind of Albanian administration. She was the first woman to work in the Albanian administration. She was quite, used to being around men and was, a very confident person and so on. And then eventually when the communists came to power, my grandfather was sent to prison and she was deported. So she was born in this aristocratic family in the Ottoman Empire and then ended up being the most persecuted. Her husband was in prison. She was a single mother. She was working in the fields. She went from having had servants all her life into having to basically clean bathrooms and doing all these kind of jobs that at least people of her social class up to that point thought were degrading. And I think one of the things that she took away from these experiences was she was always progressive. I mean, she wasn't a socialist or anything like that, but kind of someone who could see injustice and could see privilege and resent it in some ways as well. And the one thing that she carried with her was this idea that there's something about people that people have dignity in them and they have moral values. And it doesn't matter what system you live in, nobody can take away this kind of inner core of dignity. And to her, she said, they took my money and they took my titles and so on, but they couldn't, and they tried to humiliate me, but they couldn't humiliate me because I was always a moral person. I always chose the right thing. And I didn't make these compromises. When I was listed to become a reporter, a spy, I didn't accept. And I took the kind of cost of that. So she always felt like she had made decisions within these margins of unfreedom. And she wasn't a political person, but there was something about her, I think, about her kind of philosophical worldview that makes one become a political person if you reflect on it, because this idea that you have to be critical and you have to be moral makes you then judge morally, regardless of the ideology with which any given thing is packed, everything that surrounds you. And I think that's how my views, I guess, connect to hers in a way that is not straightforwardly political, but in a way that kind of connects the moral and the political.
Yes, definitely. Great. And so I want to move a little bit now to the period of the transition. In your book, you don't, really express nostalgia for Husha's Albania, but there are also serious critiques of the transition and the kind of freedom that is being imported from the West. So the chapter on the World Bank man, Vincent Vandenberg, the crocodile, who exclaims at one point, "I'm free," as a way to protest against his Albanian host. I mean, I thought that was a really great chapter in the way that you also show like this agenda of World Bank reform going to many parts of the world and flattening out really all the specifics of people, with formulaic solutions, basically, right? That it reminded you of your primary school teacher, Nora, when she discussed oppression in other parts of the world, also, which she probably didn't know that much about, and the cure being the global proletarian revolution, except now the cure was, open markets, and elections and so on. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that experience. So I have a sense from you, at least from what I remember of the book, that you don't experience this time as one of great freedom. I think Maria might have a different experience. I'll ask her to talk a little bit about that, but maybe you can talk a little bit about why that is in your case, Lea.
Yeah, so I mean, in part of it, I think it's just growing up and being a teenager and you're just miserable. And so you kind of see, you're miserable in a country that is struggling economically and is in this kind of crisis transition, and all the categories are shattered around you and so on. So that makes you, I guess, inherently more miserable. There was that, but there was also this contrast between my parents, who seem to think that now we have all these freedoms, that all these freedoms were there for me to enjoy and use to the best of my knowledge and capacities and so on. And on the one hand, I think I resented the burden of responsibility that that gave to me, this idea that, you know, your father has spent 50 years under communism, your mother, I mean, I'm sure you recognize this from your parents as well, but there's a sense in which there's these parents with failed lives who have done everything for you, and you are now in this world of opportunities, and you have to take responsibility for the opportunities, and for everything you do is your responsibility. You can't blame the state anymore in the way in which they could blame the state. And so maybe this is how I started to think back then, well, maybe, hang on, maybe I can't blame the state actually. So maybe there are things that I can't do, like going out in the evening because I might be harassed on the streets, or, you know, can't go, you know, or seeing people around me not having opportunities that I thought should have been available to everyone. So this idea that there is this freedom that has arrived, and somehow you see the cracks, and you see there's a lot of immigration still, there's a lot of people who are miserable, there's a lot of social injustice. My father at one point was, like I say in the book, a director of the port, and he had to make redundant a lot of Roma workers. And I remember these workers in tears every morning coming to our house to say, please don't sack us. And my dad was saying, well, I have to sack them because we have to modernize the port. And so all these kind of dilemmas that are presented as somehow these are just the kind of unintended consequences, the casualties of a process or of structures being set in motion and being a certain way. And I think if you're already resentful because you have all this burden of responsibility, plus you see what's going on, you become, I guess, extra critical. But on the other hand, I also think this process of, and I think this may also be resonating across Eastern Europe, there is something about moving from one ideology to the other, in the sense of being, on the one hand, you're in the grip of these ideologies. So you're in the grip of communism, and then you kind of get rid of that ideology, and now you're in this other society that has another ideology. And you have this army of people who come with this belief that this society works, and that's the World Bank and the IMF and the civil society, the NGOs, you know, the Open Society Institute, all the things that were kind of descending into Eastern Europe at that point. These were all, I say in the book, missionaries of sorts. And I think they really were like missionaries, because they came with this kind of belief that now we're delivering the free world and this is going to work. That's on the one side. And on the other side, you have these victims of history who have had this kind of generations in which they can't really bring themselves to believe into anything, but what they can do is just survive circumstances. And the way in which they survive circumstances is by pretending that, yeah, that's right, that's freedom. And so I remember, and this is anecdotal, but I think it really resonates across Eastern Europe, when people were preparing, for example, funding plans for funding agencies. Now, we all fake a little bit funding plans for funding agencies, but I have never seen the degree of cynicism that I have seen in Eastern Europe when people were preparing these reports to say how great civil society was and how, like, we need to add this and we need to add. It was completely instrumental and completely fake, because people saw, oh, well, you know, we've survived the Ottoman Empire, we've survived the fascists, we survived the Nazis, we've survived the communists, we're going to survive the World Bank as well. And this was the spirit in which a lot of these things were kind of accepted and implemented, which, if that is the spirit, it can't be good for democracy. And my worry is that some of these things are actually still like that. They haven't changed. You know, it's the EU, or it's like strategic partnerships, or there's just like things come in packages, and often ideological packages, and people accept them, not necessarily because they believe in them, but because that's just what you do when you have to get on with stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right, Maria, do you want to add your reflections about your own experience? And do you want me to show the PowerPoint of one of the pictures?
No, I was going to respond to what Lea just said. And I think this is a very, I mean, when I read the post-communism chapters, again, sort of I identified with a lot of the stories. But then I also at points thought, okay, but all of this post-communist hardship, or not all of it, but a significant portion of it was actually the communist regime victimizing people a second time, in the sense that the structural reforms were, it wasn't just ideological sort of switching, taking over another ideology and being just as zealous with it, but it was a reaction to the fact that these economies were disintegrating, were collapsing, and people were trying to sort of, you know, fill the holes so the ship doesn't sink. And there was I mean, I totally get your point about and agree with the point about a lot of these Western advisors coming in not really knowing anything about the nuance on the ground, perceiving that it doesn't matter whether you're in Bulgaria or Bolivia or Albania or and offering the same sort of formulaic solutions. I totally get that. But at the same time, even if they were not there, even if they had not arrived with their ideas, the economies were struggling, and something would have had to be done to deal with it. And so that's why I saw the story of your father struggling with laying off these Roma workers, and I was thinking, I don't know that I can blame the World Bank for his struggle there. You know, it's also the communist regime victimizing him a second time by putting him in this position. So that was my reaction to that part of the book.
Yeah, can I come back to that? Because I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, I think there's two questions there. One is counterfactually, was there anything that could have been done? Not just if the World Bank people hadn't come, but also if the locals had responded in a different way to the World Bank people coming. So because I think the responsibility goes both ways. And when I say about the World Bank guy that he comes and he's convinced and so on, so he has his responsibilities. But there's also a responsibility of citizens to say, well, actually, hang on, let us also tell you something. And in that way, I think you're right that there is a sense in which these people come from a system which hasn't given them agency. And because they're not feeling like agents, and that's the legacy, then they don't reveal their agency. So that's one set of questions. And I think it's a really interesting one counterfactually, because, you know, what would have happened if people had actually really driven these changes forward without outside pressure to drive the changes in the direction in which the change was prescribed. So as a kind of internal change that continued to be an internal change. And this is that was a lot of the motivation actually when I started writing the book, was to recover the spirit of these kind of dissident movements in the 90s, like Solidarność or, you know, Havel and so on, which weren't neoliberal movements when they started. They were like democracy movements. And so what would have happened if these democracy movements had actually fulfilled their democratic potential, or the things that they wanted to realize, without having to go with the free market neoliberal packages as well? So that's one set of questions. The second set of questions, on which I'm a little bit more skeptical, is that I think the struggles of the port of Durrës, yes, they were the struggles of the port of Durrës. Yes, communism is responsible for a lot of it, but there are struggles in the port of Liverpool that are like that. And there's countries in the kind of advanced capitalist core that still have these daily dilemmas to resolve, of unemployment, of people being made redundant, of like cost cutting and so on. So I think there is a sense in which what we missed in the kind of narrative of Eastern Europe was we saw our struggles as completely detached from these Western struggles of the crisis and so on. And maybe they weren't detached, you know, maybe they're part of the same. So it's true that some of that would have still happened because of communism. But on the other hand, we are now in 2021 and it's 31 years since communism has left, you know, for good. And we still have a lot of these daily struggles. You still have immigration, you still have problems with brain drain, you still have problems with unemployment, you still have a lot of social anomie. So, you know, how long are people going to blame communism for this stuff? And when are they going to actually start blaming the system that they live in? And that was also part of my, I guess, the reason why I feel like I went harder on the second part than a lot of people were maybe prepared to go on the ground in those countries. And that's what's kind of maybe taken aback a lot of people. But yeah, I mean, I take your points, but I think there's a kind of other story that we see our worlds as still divided. And I think at this point, they're not that divided. They're kind of more integrated than divided.
Mm-hmm. 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 All right, great. Well, I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we have many people who want to contribute. But so I think I'll just ask one last question, which is, in the world we live in today, in the face of financial collapse, pandemic, racial injustice, climate change, and also so much evidence of political incompetence and dysfunction, and as you've just said, the legacies of the past on political agency, what sources of hope for the struggle for freedom sustain you in our current circumstances? And ultimately, what do you hope that your book, for example, will contribute to our understanding of the idea of freedom, as well as disagreements about freedom in today's conditions?
Okay, so about the book, I feel like I don't feel like I have, especially not from this book, like from my academic books, I feel like I have a takeaway idea that I want people to read it and be convinced of this. So when you read Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, I want people to be convinced that global egalitarianism is the way to go and to think about the world along those lines. I think with this book, it's actually much less ambitious in a way. And also partly the way it was written was supposed to be like that. So I don't feel like I have an interpretation that I want people to take away from the book. I just want them to be provoked and have questions and kind of think about, okay, maybe there's another way of looking at this, everything, like communism, liberalism, their lives, their families, their identities, their whatever. So I feel like if the book leaves people with questions, it has done its job in a way. And I don't really want it to do a lot more than that, because all the rest is conversations that start with questions. About hope, I mean, as you know, I'm a Kantian, so I don't really need to have any, like, the world doesn't need to nurture my hope. For me, being hopeful is a moral duty. Like, you know, you're a moral agent. When you're a moral agent, you have a duty to do certain things. When you have a duty to do certain things, you have to assume that these things can be done. And that's it, like, that's the end of the matter for me. So, and in fact, I feel that is the only counterpoint I have to this very deep skepticism and doubt that also lives in me. This is the only thing, if you're really skeptical and doubtful of everything, the only thing that can keep you going is if you have a kind of duty to, okay, I just still need to act, and I just still need to choose the good, and I still need to be a moral agent. And that's enough. That's it. That's hope. That's the hope. But I don't really need to have much more than that to actually go. So to keep going.
Wonderful. Well, the moral politician who reads the political circumstances, right, in ways that make possible conditions of right. I mean, that is Kant's. But
I wanted to hear Maria and you as well, actually, on this. I want to know what gives you hope.
Okay, Maria.
Good question. Actually, what gives me hope is, I think despite the difficult start in the 90s, I think the region has actually made strides in those 30 years. I think the post-communist countries, the Eastern European post-communist countries, not the post-Soviet, unfortunately, have made significant strides in really embracing the idea that they cannot go back to the kind of regime that puts parents in a position in which they have to lie to their children about their basic views. You know, that kind of tyranny, I think, is now politically impossible in much of Eastern Europe. And I think, I mean, I've spent a lot of the last few weeks thinking about Russia's threat to Ukraine, and it's making me think that Eastern Europe has actually, and Ukraine also, has actually sort of cut the cord with this absolute authoritarianism that in some ways has been reestablished in Russia, and is sort of, Russia is sort of exporting right now to its former sphere of influence. So that's my hope. And I was actually right now, these days, trying to write an article for popular consumption that says Bulgaria is now abroad and it would like to stay this way. Because it wasn't abroad in the Soviet sphere of influence. And that's the huge change that has happened in the 30 years, and which definitely gives me hope.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I won't talk about the Eastern European context, but I would say in the Canadian context, you know, whenever I despair of Canadian policies of various kinds, I wonder whether I really have whether despair is kind of a privilege, you know. So basically I look at the facts about Indigenous history and think, well, they've gone through, hundreds of years of Indigenous annihilation and elimination, the doctrine of, settler colonialism. And yet, we still have Indigenous peoples, and they are still struggling for recognition of self-determination and so on. And so I think, well, if people who are the most oppressed in our society, are still maintaining that struggle, then who am I, to kind of give up on that, right? So I think I'm also with you in terms of Kant. I also think that then it is a duty, certainly, to not cave into despair, because I think that does then just allow for all the wrong things to perpetuate. So I think in that sense, yeah, one cannot know what the outcome is going to be, but but in the end, one can only try to do the right thing, and I think that's all that we can do, really, and expect of each other. I also want to say, Lea, that your hopes for your book, I think, is exactly what makes it great literature. In my view, what has always made great literature is not that it gives you one argument. It's not like a philosophical argument that convinces you of something. Instead, what it does is it really, like you say, disturbs, disorients, opens up, provokes, makes you question. And I also think there's a lot of political philosophy that historically has done that as well. I think of Plato's Republic as like that. I think of the work of Judith Shklar as like that. They're not people who are interested in building up very coherent models or arguments, about a particular thing, but they just disturb, what do you think justice is, or what freedom is? And I think that the way that people have reacted, and I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I can tell, and I know that in Albania, the reactions, some of them have been quite extreme. And I do think, that certainly my work also, provokes extreme responses from some people. And I'm very interested in why it does that, right? And why people have difficulty engaging. I think it's often because people are often still fighting in their own sort of prisons, they're still trapped in, like, say, the Cold War. and so they read, like, your book and say, well, you must be on the wrong side because you're critiquing, like liberal reforms, right? But that's a mentality of someone who's still in that, like, fight, right? And who hasn't been able to kind of think beyond it in a way to try to respond to the contemporary struggles. Yeah, but anyway, I think it's very important that this kind of or disorientation happens, because I think that can be morally productive, and hopefully open up conversations like the one that we have just had. So thank you so much, Maria and Lea. And I'm going to now open it up to the floor. So we'll just, if I can ask you to put your hand up if you want to ask a question. And I believe our coordinator is going to be able to unmute you, or you might be able to unmute yourself now. Okay, great. So Piotr, please also briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you all for such a marvelous discussion. I'm Piotr Grosicki. I'm actually a history professor at the University of Maryland, but I live in Montreal. Thank you, Catherine, for cluing me into this marvelous event. I hope to read the book next week. I think it just came out in Canada 3 days ago. So I don't have my copy yet, but I always feel sort of privileged, both as Polish and a scholar of Poland, when thinking comparatively or broadly about Eastern Europe, because it feels like so many of the anchor points are so much rosier in some sense, but maybe even lead more toward the kind of despair that you were all just discouraging us from indulging a minute ago. Maybe this notion that solidarity has been defeated. A friend of mine, David Ost, had that memorable title for his book about 15 years ago. And he meant it as a general point, I think. He didn't just mean it in a post-communist sense. He meant it in a broad sense of interclass solidarity and perspectives for moving beyond. I was just reading reviewing a manuscript about post-memory too. And you think about the intergenerational transmission of trauma of the sort that, I get that your book is about, Lea, and I think that it's really, this is the kind of thing that's necessary, a wide audience reception. So I have a very short question to follow up to that, and a bigger question for the panel. The first one is, how do you think do you think at all about this book reaching Albanian and more broadly East European audiences? In the sense, of course, mass market books take on a life of their own in terms of reception. And it seems like there's a real power here, heuristically and morally. I'll take your category too. So what do you want to happen? And then the bigger question that I was going to ask actually connects to my own research, which is, it sounded like there's a sort of sense that civil society really, it's gotten better. I don't know if I completely agree with your optimism, Maria. I think I'm much more pessimistic, especially in the past couple of years, but it does seem like it's gotten better. When you look at the sort of the discussions of a lot of the dissidents who are organizing the governments, especially, I write a lot about Tadeusz Mazowiecki in Poland. They say they became neoliberal because the third way was not realistic. It was just talk. It didn't matter if you were religious. It didn't matter what the basis, the foundations of your morality or your moral views were. At the end of the day, they needed a policy, right? And you were all referring this. Something had to be done, I think you said, Maria. And what they did was bring in the World Bank. And yes, Jeff Sachs can wave his hands and say, yes, I did this, or I didn't do this, depending how we look at the outcome. But Lea, do you feel like the third way really was a mirage? Because I kind of get that implication from you, and I'm not sure. They certainly seem to have thought so, even though many of them staked their dissident credentials on it. But in the end, looking back, I don't know. And I think that helps to inform looking forward. Sorry about the long comment. This was so wonderful. Thank you all.
Right, thanks. So can I just ask a question? When you say the third way, because I live in Britain, so whenever we say third way, we mean Tony Blair, but you don't mean the third way of Tony Blair. You mean like the third way as in like this kind of Eastern European third way. Yeah, great. Yeah, so, okay, so these two questions are actually connected for me. The first question of the audience, yes, I would love the book to reach to Eastern Europe much more than it reaches Western Europe. So it saddens me a little bit when people in the West love it and people in Albania are like, I'm not sure. But I am also very hopeful because I get loads and loads of messages from people all over, like Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, and so on, readers who are in the West, but who kind of, read the book and, like you said, Maria, recognize things or interpret the same things differently and want to kind of share their stories and so on. And I'm hoping, I have a couple of translations, one in Romania and one in Poland. And of course in Albania it's been going for a while. So and I really want to see what these debates look from the inside. The thing, and this is connected to the stuff that Catherine was saying a little bit about Albania. It's true that in Albania, the reception has been much more mixed than in everywhere else, basically. So everywhere else, the book has had incredible reviews from the far right to the far left, which was way beyond my expectations. And in Albania, it's been much more polarized. So I get emails from people saying, I love it, and so on. But there's also people who say, oh, this is just like, giving these symmetries between the liberal period and the communist period. And it's like making these two things like they're the same and so on. And to me, there is a very serious reason behind the anger in Albania that the book provokes, beyond the fact that I might not be happy about it, or that I don't like it when people criticize my book, or I don't like it when people say, oh, you're just like a hojaist or nostalgic or whatever. I think there's a problem when a book like a small country like that takes over a global audience and there are no other books to counterbalance that point of view, because then the book becomes representative of the country. And I don't think it should be the case that, a small country should be represented by one book. Like there should be hundreds of books that tell different stories about the country and so on. So while it doesn't make me personally happy that, people are kind of angry with my book and they're like, oh, the West is now reading about Albania through Lea Ypi and like what she's telling them is going to be the official story. I can completely understand the frustration and the anger with that. And that's why I think it's so important that the book finds an audience in Eastern Europe and encourages a kind of Eastern European, at least, debate about these questions that is not mediated by Western audiences, because the Western audiences, they will be interested, they will find interesting things to say. Some of the reviews are incredibly perceptive. So it's not like that people don't get it, but they just come from a different political positioning and it serves a different project. And it's natural that it serves that different project. Whereas I find if it did find its way in Eastern Europe, and that's why it's connected to your second question, then I think it really would open a debate about what would it be like to chart a different path in which Eastern European countries contribute to the world development as equals in a way. Because I think one of the problems we've had is historically we just kind of we're the losers. We got communism wrong. We were done by the Ottoman Empire. Like everything has been a mess, basically. And so I think it's time for people to get their own agency. And if they can only have the agency if they get angry with books, if they write other books that fight this book and so on. And I think that's why I think it's like really important, and also really important not to be angry with the critics. I mean, I got upset at the beginning because some of the critiques are very personal, and sometimes you get, angry because they can be sexist or whatever. There's different levels at which people can criticize you. But I think it's super important that people say, hey, don't just believe this book on Albania. Like, that's so natural that it shouldn't be like that, and that there should be way more perspectives.
Maria, do you want to answer or comment at all on Piotr's questions?
No, I think let's take more.
Okay, great. Then next we'll have Peggy Cohn. Peggy, welcome.
Hi, I'm Peggy Cohn. I'm a professor of political theory at University of Toronto. So thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me. This has been an amazing event. Since the book did just come out a couple of days ago, I haven't read the whole thing, but I have read the beginning, and it's completely stunning. It's so beautifully written. And so the question that I wanted to ask Lea is about her practice of writing. So, we are very familiar with the conventions of, writing literature, fiction books, and of course also of academic writing and the genre of analytic political philosophy. And so I was very interested in your experience of constructing and crafting a memoir, because when I think of memoir, while these are true events, you're still telling a story of your life and creating yourself as a character. And you very vividly, I think, in the beginning of the book, described the shift at the age of 11 when you came to sort of rethink the story of your family. But I was wondering if there was another shift in writing the memoir now as an adult, about seeing that time, whether you feel like there were different stories you could have told of that period, in the sense that, we contain contradictions, and are there different vignettes that would have maybe led to a different story, and kind of how you came to think about the experience through the practice of writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually a really difficult one as well. I think I structured the book based on ideas first. So I wanted to write about freedom. I wanted to give these different perspectives on freedom. And there were themes that I knew I wanted to talk about. So in the communist period, I wanted to talk about kind of neighborhood relationships and community. I wanted to talk about queues. I wanted to talk about political prisons and about persecution and all the kind of political censorship aspects. I wanted to talk about indoctrination at school. And so there are all these themes that I wanted to talk about. And in a way, the selection of the vignettes came oriented by the themes, because I knew that if you're talking about the communist world, like, these were the things that I felt were important to talk about. And likewise with the liberal, the book is in two parts. The second part is about the kind of liberal period. I wanted to talk about civil society, which is like this big term, which has shaped whoever's grown up in the 90s in Eastern Europe, like, knows about civil society. And I wanted to talk about, pluralism, structural reforms, all these terms, and in connection to freedom. So the choice of vignettes was driven by the choice of topics that I, as a theorist, felt was important to tackle when talking about these different periods and talking about freedom. So absolutely, there could have been others. And sometimes there was a little thing that I remembered, and I kind of built on the memory, literary details, or I kind of try to articulate the character or refine the characters, which is causing, again, huge trouble in my family, because people sometimes read the book and they're like, well, I don't recognize this character. And I'm like, yeah, I know you don't recognize it, because it's a creation. So definitely there could have been other stories that I could have told that would have probably driven other arguments, and all the ones that I have told aren't, objective facts. I think they're true, but they're not factual. And I think this is a really important thing to distinguish when you're talking about memoir, is that not everything in a memoir is factually true, but it is true because it's a process of memorizing, is a process of kind of recovering from your inner self. And so of reviving your thoughts and connecting your current thought processes to your past thought processes and so on. So I feel like it's a really interesting genre actually to work with.
Lea, as a follow-up, when you say it's true but not factual, I mean, does that mean something like, especially in a memoir format, for example, your accounting of your childhood experiences of solidarity, for example, in the queues? Now, that is true in the sense of your life experience as a child, which you recover. It's not necessarily, factual in the sense that, like, the conditions in which people were forced to have to cooperate in certain ways in order to get certain things, like all of that is not Yeah, and also just like the counterfactuals, which are that obviously neighbors didn't trust each other, and your parents worried about being informed upon. Certainly, my parents, the major legacy of the Cultural Revolution was a complete inability to trust anyone. So in Canada, they really made no friends because they were incapable of friendship, really, upon which trust. So I think those things are in your memoir, but yeah, do you think that by telling what is true?
They're not. When I say they're not factual, I mean the details of the situation may be reconstructed. Like maybe so, for example, a lot of the characters sometimes are characters merge. So there were three people and to these three people, these three things happened. But for the sake of the book, you can't have like 30 characters. You can only have one character, and then you bring in details from the three characters that and they all become part of the one character. So that's the difference, basically. So I would say the generics are all true and factual as it happens. So it's true that there was this family, it's true that I was born in this family, that they had these beliefs and so on. When I reconstruct the conversation, obviously it's memory, so you don't remember actually, that your father turned pale. He might have turned red, or he might have turned green, or he might have not turned anything at all. But the generic, the species is true, and the literary device is the one that kind of gives layers to that to render that more readable and to. So yeah, and so that's why also when you're dealing, and this another thing that's kind of troubling a lot of Albanians is the genre of the book and the difference between nonfiction and fiction. So all nonfiction books get fact checking for the important stuff, and so they want to make sure that when you say my great-grandfather was the prime minister of Albania, that is actually fact checked and that you're not making that up. But the details in which you discover that your great-grandfather was a prime minister of Albania, I remember it, I read it in a book. Now, was it a history book? Was it someone told me? Did I see it somewhere? Did I overhear it? These are the stuff, the kind of detail that is irrelevant to the universal public, let's say, and that is only there to convey the general structure of the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Jump in very quickly to say on this topic that for me as an Eastern European reader, that was really evident immediately, that sort of, it's probably not likely that the kid who killed cats is also the kid who happens to be like 5 extraordinary things don't happen to the same person, but they all read, and I think that's what makes this book so amazing, is that they all read authentic. I'm sure these things happen, but you realize that these are constructions of characters.
Okay, great. So about the narrative of writing and how to avoid the problem of the messiness and the ubiquity of life. Okay, Jiwoo, welcome. Jiwoo Song.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Jiwoo Song. I teach at Seoul National University. I don't know if the book's being translated into Korean. I got a copy of the English version and I loved it. My question's partly been answered, but so one of the many bits that were interesting in this book, one of the things that I found fascinating was your description of how these various kinds of tourists were sort of consuming as it were, the product of Albania when they were coming on these trips. And that, along with the World Bank character, led me to wonder whether you have had time to reflect on the reception of your book in Western Europe and North America. And you've already answered this question a bit, but for instance, what kinds of political project do you see at play in these receptions? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't know, because I feel the book needs a bit more time to sink in. Like there is a kind of immediate response to it, and there's a long-term response to it. And I think it's hard to infer the longer-term political project from the immediate response. So to me, it looks like the immediate response has been so lively because I think in a way it's a book about crisis, and we live in a time of crisis. And so people read, when they recognize the book, even though it's a book about Albania, it's actually not it's not that they're drawn to it because of Albania. They're drawn to it because it's a book that talks about crisis and systemic changes and people's lives kind of undergoing these fundamental transformations and what you need to think through these different categories and so on. So I feel like that's what's made it somehow attractive, despite all the skepticism that I remember when I started writing the book. All my editors, especially the US editors who were actually buying the rights, they were like, nobody cares about Albania in the US. Like, how are you gonna, we can't sell this book in the US. And, you know, you need to take Albania out, or you need to reduce it, or please, it can't be a memoir. Like, I remember my American editor, like, being really insistent that this should not be a memoir. This should just be a book of political ideas and political theory, and like, no stories from Albania, please, because nobody even knows where Albania is. So I think there is a sense in which it has resonated despite all of these constraints, but which has had the nice side effect of actually making people realize, hey, there are worlds out there that things happen, people live, you know, stuff goes on, and it might be interesting to know how they think and what they do and how they think about the future. So I think that would be, for me, the nicest thing is if the book is not going back to tourists, is not just consumed, but also used as something that makes people learn something about a different context and makes them more open to that context. And I'm hoping that it will make them want to get more authors from Albania and buy more books from Eastern Europe, and just kind of deparochialize literature and political theory and all these other fields that I think are very monolithic and very restricted and kind of set in their way. So what you need is sometimes you have a book from the margins that can open the door, and then there's more stuff, and then conversations change. And I mean, I'm an intellectual, so the way in which you are political by being an intellectual is if you contribute to conversation that changes the way in which things are perceived. So
wonderful. Thank you so much, Jiwoo, for joining. I know it's like midnight there, so thank you for staying up so late. All right, next, Vanessa.
Thanks. So my name is Vanessa Rampton. I'm a postdoc and intellectual historian at McGill. I've been working on ideas of freedom and progress in the Russian context. But my question is about Albania. And I will say I have been there not so long ago, and I loved it. It was wonderful to visit. But a really strong impression I had from being there and talking to people was that Albanians themselves did not consider their experience to have so much in common with the rest of Eastern Europe. And of course, there are obvious historical reasons for and isolation and so on. It's been really interesting for me in the roundtable to see these commonalities. But my question is just whether you could say something more about that kind of uniqueness, or like perceived uniqueness anyways, of the Albanian experience of freedom and unfreedom.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, this is like the beginnings of Anna Karenina, you know, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So it's true that if you have this kind of experience of unfreedom, then, you know, your experience of unfreedom is going to be distinctive from other experiences of unfreedom, and that it will matter to you that it's a distinctive experience. I think there is something to the fact that Albania was extreme, and in a way, hearing Maria talk about like how people thought about the death of the Soviet leaders and so on, just the fact that there were many Soviet leaders to worship, to me, is like, feels like progress. You know, hey, you guys, you know, there was Brezhnev, there was Andropov, there was Khrushchev, you had a choice, whereas we only had Enver Hoxha. So that's kind of, and you didn't really have a choice to like not be sad when Enver Hoxha died. Although I think there is also a generational difference there in terms of if people were a little bit older than me, then they would have begun to figure out what happened, because you would get into these circles of kind of having to make decisions about going to university or not being able to join the party or not being able to join a youth organization. So I really think that a few years after, things would have been very different for me. It just happened to be this combination of circumstances that made it that I was still a child and not have political opinions that made it, that gave this kind of shape. But I think obviously there's the distinctiveness, but there's also something similar in a way in which, and this is again another really interesting question, is when people say socialism is kind of dead because all the socialist experiences around the world are failed. And to me, this always reminds me of the analogy with the kind of Catholic Church. You know, you have a Catholic Church that is still there and they're still going and people believe in it. And you had all the Crusades and you had hundreds of years. And these things, ideas and reality are always mixed with each other. And the only thing you can do is actually try and learn history and read history to figure out how they come together and how you can pick and choose from your knowledge of history when you kind of orient yourself in the future. But you don't really have a choice of like not saying, I don't care about liberalism, or I don't care about socialism, or I don't care about Catholicism, or I don't care about Islam. All of these things shape the world in which you live. They're there and you have to kind of engage with them. So yeah, so in this sense, I think the Albanian experience is, yes, distinctive in its repression and in this kind of extreme, but it's also common because it was still inspired by this worldview that inspired other countries. And so the books we read like were similar, and the ideas that we were talking about, that we shared, were similar, and the experiences of dissidents were similar. The transition had many similarities. So I think it's a bit of both.
Can I piggyback just with a two-finger on this? Throughout the book, I was just curious about one thing. Did Albanians really actually willingly clean on the streets on Saturdays, and did they try to do a fairly good job? Because that to me is the biggest contrast I see. Because we had those forced, cleaning, whatever, but nobody did anything. People showed up and kind of.
Yeah, I don't know. I clean willingly. This is the thing. It's so hard to say when someone lives in a context like that. It's just so hard to say what people believes at the time, what they believe after, what they remember about how they believed what they believed at the time, and what they remember about how they think of themselves afterwards. So now I don't think you'll find any Albanian that will say, "Oh yeah, I loved cleaning." But back then, I don't know what people thought when they were clean. It's actually very hard to say, which is in part why the project can only be a personal project. And this is why it's sort of, you can only talk about how you felt and how you remember things and share that story, as opposed to inferring that because I cleaned willingly, all Albanians must have cleaned willingly. Yeah.
Good point.
Wonderful. Well, I see that we are actually, past 11:30. So I want to give a chance to people who might have to leave to first thank the panelists, Maria, Popova, and Lea Ypi. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think this was a great idea, really, for us three daughters of revolutions and experienced transition to discuss a lot of the commonalities that in a way, but also differences that we have experienced. So thank you so much for that. And we do have more questions, so I'm going to let people who have to leave. Thank you to the audience for coming and joining this conversation. If you want to leave, you can leave now. Otherwise, we're going to just continue a little bit longer, if Lea and Maria don't mind, and just
actually, Catherine, I just received an email about someone who's meant to have a PhD interview and is waiting for me. So.
Okay.
Sorry,
you are a busy woman.
We'll have to do a separate Zoom drink or something. But I just got an email from one of my colleagues saying we're all waiting in the interview panels.
Okay. Well, then you are booked, and thank you so much for coming to this. I'm sorry to Andy for not being able to ask your question. I hope you'll be able to join another event and ask at a later point, because I'm sure there will be many other events. I'm really happy that we were able to have you for this time, Lea. Thank you so much for your insights and for this amazing book. I do think you really tell the story extremely well of your own experience, and that is in a way all you can do, and the fact that it has inspired other people to think about also their own experiences and to even write about them, as Maria has. I think that itself is, as you say, very important to filling out the reality and against the kinds of stories that are often projected ideologically in our world. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your stories as well.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.